It's a privilege to present to this joint group. I've presented many times to the Loma Linda group, as Bill knows, or for which Bill is largely responsible, let me put it that way, and several times with the AT group. This came out of an assignment or a suggestion from Lauren, saying he was having difficulty coming up with something for this week after Christmas. Wondered if I had anything. Well, I'll get into that in just a moment. But today we're going to talk about one of the most well-known and beloved characteristics of the biblical Christmas story, the virginal conception of Jesus, oftentimes referred to as the virgin birth of Jesus. Really, the miracle is in the conception, so I prefer using that terminology. Let's see if I can. There we go. This is a little overview of what I will be doing today. I typically like to talk about my task in general and specific terms. We will introduce the issue, talk about Isaiah, Matthew, and the implications for reading the Old Testament, and then wrap it up from there. So in general, I am to consider Matthew's quotation of the Old Testament in his nativity narrative. As biblical students, we often refer to these texts in Matthew and Luke as the nativity narrative, or narratives, since they are two. And I talked to you about that last year. And this is not necessarily a follow-up on that, but it is a follow-up in the general sense on the topic. Specifically, I'm going to examine Matthew's quotation of Isaiah 7:14 and its reference to the virginal conception of Jesus in relationship to the context and language of Isaiah's text. And here I want to acknowledge indirect input, at least at this stage, but real input at an earlier stage of Larry Herr, who is retired from Berman University as a professor of Hebrew Bible. His input especially involved the linguistic and historical observations associated with Isaiah 7. And it was in preparation for an article that we jointly authored for Spectrum 25 years ago, the title of which is or was the interpretation of the Old Testament in the New, Isaiah, Matthew, and the Virgin. So we looked at this material as a test case. I'm kind of reversing that today and looking specifically at this linkage between Isaiah and Matthew on this particular topic. And then as a kind of addendum, raising the question of the implications for reading the Old Testament. So that's what we will look at today. When we think of the birth of Jesus as depicted in the New Testament, especially during the Christmas season, we naturally recall those memorable statements that seem central to the story. One of these is, "Behold, the virgin shall be with child, and shall bring forth a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel," which being interpreted is God with us. This is the King James Version of Matthew 1:23. It is less likely that we will remember that this sentence appears only in Matthew and is seen by Matthew as a fulfilled Old Testament prophecy. This is clear from Matthew's previous verse, which reads, "Now all this was done that it might be fulfilled which was spoken of the Lord by the prophet, saying," and then it goes on to include the verse I read a moment ago. The prophet that Matthew had in mind was Isaiah. And Isaiah's statement is found in chapter 7, verse 14. Today, we will look at that statement, especially as it appears in the Hebrew text and in the context of Isaiah 7. We will also look at the ancient Greek or Septuagint translation. Our objective is to consider Matthew's quotation of this sentence in Isaiah in the light of these observations. We will also examine the relationship between the Old and New Testaments regarding such quotations and allusions, and how we should read the former in light of the latter. So in this combination of texts, we have the following. From Isaiah 7:14, reading now from the New Revised Standard Version. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman is with child, and shall bear a son, and shall name him Emmanuel. And then Matthew, look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God is with us. This is one of the most revered pairs of biblical texts. The Old Testament prophecy was written by a prophet who is the favorite of many, largely because of this and similar prophecies they accept as messianic. The New Testament passage is key to the cherished doctrine of the virginal conception of Jesus that, for many, proves his supernatural status. Because Matthew clearly refers to Mary and Jesus, Christians around the world and through the ages have taken the passage from Isaiah to refer also to Mary and Jesus. I was looking around for a picture of Mary and Jesus, particularly looking for something that might be appropriate representation of Mary. Now, while this is something of a Caucasian presentation, it is not that entirely. And I'm intrigued by the darker complexion of this woman. It's a very rare kind of thing to see. Mary obviously was a Palestinian person and looked obviously like that. This is about the closest I can come to depicting a Palestinian woman. So let's start with Isaiah 7. And we will look, first of all, at the political and geographic context of this material. The political context is the Syro-Ephraimite War. The historical and context and political context is, as I've indicated, this war from the 8th century BCE that pitted the Syrian nation of Damascus and Israel, whose main tribe was Ephraim, on one side, against Judah on the other. This was during the time, of course, of the divided kingdoms. The Assyrian superpower was threatening the whole region because the region stood in the way of Assyria's march on Egypt. To counter this pressure, it was necessary for the Palestinian nations to form periodic coalitions against Assyria, as they did effectively in 853 BCE. Damascus and Israel were committed to the coalition. Judah was not. Isaiah argued that King Ahaz should let Yahweh, their God, defend the nation, while the king and his secular faction pushed for an alliance with Syria against these northern neighbors. Now, Ahaz thought, would be a good time for Judah to defeat Israel and Damascus and thereby curry the favor of Assyria. So, Damascus and Israel besieged Jerusalem, weakening Judah. Edom rebelled from Judah. and the latter thereby lost control of the southeastern portions of its small empire. Ahaz was convinced that he needed Assyria's protection from the two northern neighbors, so he was preparing to send ambassadors to King Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria, formally asking for aid. So Isaiah 7 is set in the context of Ahaz considering whether to make this request. And so Isaiah went to him and argued that Ahaz should place his trust in Yahweh, Israel's God, not Tiglath-Pileser. Although Isaiah made the argument as a religious appeal, his advice also made geopolitical sense, because Assyria, if called in by Judah, could use the invitation not only to defeat Damascus and Israel, but then to turn its own occupation, move its own occupation close to Judah, making the latter simply a vassal in this process. We're looking now at particularly the first 13 verses that lead up to our focus text here, considering not only the political context, but the literary context. Chapter 7 opens with the report of an unsuccessful attack on Jerusalem by Damascus and Israel during the reign of Ahaz. This attack and the alliance between these two enemies of Judah terrified Ahaz and his people. And this is the subject matter of verses 1 and 2. For the rest of the material down through verse 13, we find that Yahweh sent Isaiah and his son to tell Ahaz not to worry about his enemies because they would not succeed. Ahaz too would fail if he were to stand firm, if he were not to stand firm in his faith. Yahweh, not directly, but probably through Isaiah, told Ahaz to ask him for a sign, no matter how outrageous it might be. But the king replied, again, presumably to Isaiah, I will not ask. I will not put the Lord. And here he's using the divine name, represented in the English translation with the word Lord in all capital letters. I will not put Yahweh to the test. Then Isaiah said, Hear then, O house of David, kind of like referring to the White House, I suppose. Is it too little for you to worry mortals, that you worry my God also? So this is what we learn in verses 3 to 13. So this is the political and literary introduction to verse 14. So Isaiah continued by telling Ahaz that the Lord, and here he uses the word Adonai instead of Yahweh, the Lord, that's why this is not all caps. The Lord will give you a sign anyway. And that's verse 14a. And then he goes on to say, telling him what the sign would be. Look, the young woman is with child, and shall bear a son, and shall name him Emmanuel. The announcement of a sign and its context had direct and immediate importance to the political situation at hand, and nothing to do with some distant event in the future. The sign was intended to assure Ahaz that Yahweh would keep his promise to protect the nation. It involved people and activities in Ahaz's day that were meant to sway the king to trust Yahweh's advice and assurances. So here are the contents then. There are a number of different expressions here. First is the young woman. The Hebrew ha'alma means exactly that and nothing more. The young woman. It's a particular young woman, hence the article that goes with this noun. This is the translation of most contemporary English versions like the New Revised Standard. This refers to a post-adolescent young woman, whether married or not, and therefore whether a virgin or not. It has no nuance about sexual or marital status. The Hebrew does not use the common word for an unmarried virginal female. That would be the word betulah. It happens to be translated with a comparable Greek word in the Septuagint and is reflected that way in the King James Version. We'll come back to that in a bit. So there's the identity of a person, the young woman. And then there are three acts which follow. So she is with child. The form of this Hebrew word hara is probably best translated like this in the present tense. So this is a pregnant woman. The young woman is pregnant. There's nothing future about this statement. The King James translates it with a future verb, shall conceive, but that is probably not what the Hebrew means. The second act is shall bear a son. The Hebrew probably actually means that the woman was giving birth at that time. So she is pregnant and she is delivering a son. And the third act is the future act, which is she shall call him Emmanuel. Now, this is a typical Hebrew two-part sentence name containing the general word for deity, El, mixed with the word for being present, Emmanuel, giving you Emmanuel. If the woman is giving birth at this time, then the sign is what she will call this baby. So, a woman being pregnant at that time or any other time was not particularly unique. That she was giving birth to a son is not unique. Approximately half of the births would have been so characterized, but nobody would have known what name she would give him. So the real sign is that she calls his name Emmanuel. Now, the context of Isaiah 7 on this particular topic continues for another couple of verses. The time and place in the reign of Ahaz is the focus then of the next two verses 15 and 16 in this chapter, as the prophet further discussed the growth and development of the child Emmanuel. The text says he shall eat curds and honey by the time he knows how to refuse evil and choose the good. The next verse says, for before the child knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land before whose two kings you are in dread will be deserted. However, it is not Emmanuel who is important, that is, this male child, so-called, but the assurance that before he fully matures, Judah's enemies will be eliminated. That is to say, the child whose name signifies the presence of God will himself be a sign of divinely achieved national victory. This whole story then has a locus in the 8th century BCE and does not anticipate an event many centuries later. So in summary then, we find that the court of Ahaz will receive a sign that Yahweh intends to arrange the defeat of Judah's enemies. This sign will involve the conception and birth of a male child to a particular young woman, and especially the fact that she will name him Emmanuel. Despite later in the prophecy of Isaiah, we don't have the identity of this child. Now, some of the language later on seems to interact a bit with the birth of a child to Isaiah by the name of Marashal al-Hashbaz. But there is no specific connection in the text. So I think the child in 7:14 remains unknown. In Isaiah, all aspects of this account and the prediction it contains deal exclusively with the time of Ahaz and the immediate events thereafter. So, did Isaiah predict the virginal conception of Jesus? No. This is not a prediction of a virginal conception of any sort, much less one that would occur many centuries in the future. So, let's pick up Matthew 1 then and see how this is used. Matthew contains one of two infancy narratives in the New Testament that feature the birth of Jesus. The other, as you know, in what we talked about last year, is in the Gospel of Luke. After an abbreviated genealogy of Jesus of Nazareth that opens Matthew's Gospel, his Christmas story begins in chapter 1:18. And there we find that before his mother Mary began living with Joseph, she became pregnant by, as the text says, the Holy Spirit. Her fiance was about to dismiss her quietly when an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph and told him to marry her because the Holy Spirit had impregnated her. She would have a son whom he, that is Joseph, was to call Jesus because he would save people from sin. In verses 22 and 23, Matthew makes clear the connection to Isaiah. All this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. That prophet refers to Isaiah. And Matthew went on to say, look, now he's quoting Isaiah 7:14 loosely. The virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call him Emmanuel, which means God is with us. And this is the verse that comes from Isaiah 7:14. So you have then reference to a person and three acts, just as in Isaiah 7. Matthew, however, refers to this person as he parthenos, a term in Greek which means specifically a person who has not engaged in sexual intercourse, therefore a virgin. BDAG, BDAG refers to the principal lexicon for the New Testament that where we find the meaning of words used in that and other early Christian literature. The word here is, and most commonly, is feminine. Has that thing that looks like a little N with a backwards apostrophe above it. That's the Greek article, feminine article, the feminine. But it can also have, in rare cases, a masculine article, which means a male person who is considered virginal. But clearly, this text is using an expression that unabashedly means the virgin. So what about this virgin? Well, the virgin shall be pregnant. Engastri hexe. This is a future tense verb, unlike the present form that seems to be used in Isaiah 7:14. So that's the first act. The second act is shall bear a son. Now the word shall doesn't usually appear in the translation, although it does in the King James Version. This is also a future verb. Texatai, the future form of that verb. And it is, it's also plural. Also, I think it should say here, it's also future. I represented here. It's present. It's a future singular, not a plural. It's a future form element. And then, but the third characteristic act here is said, they shall name him Emmanuel. Now, the naming of this son, Emmanuel, here put in the representation of the Greek with an E instead of an I at the beginning, is common to the Isaiah 7 material. However, the person in Isaiah who calls him Emmanuel is the same person who is pregnant and who is delivering a child, a son. In Matthew, it is they, undefined. Who are they who shall call him Emmanuel? Matthew doesn't say, and since this doesn't represent the wording in Isaiah, we can't go back there for an understanding. But this is a third person plural verb. The subject is they. Matthew then claims that the virginal conception of Jesus fulfilled a prophecy of Isaiah, even while somewhat misquoting Isaiah's words. Oh, I've got a couple of tables here which graphically show the comparison, in this case, between Isaiah, and this should read 7. I don't know how I made so many mistakes on this, but Isaiah 7:14 compared to Matthew 1:23. Matthew speaks of the virgin. Isaiah speaks of the young woman. Act 1 is she shall conceive. She is with child. Matthew clearly makes it future. Isaiah could be understood that way, but probably is to be understood in the present. Act 2 is she shall bear a son. That could be a rendition of Isaiah. She shall bear, but also more likely means is actually delivering a son. They shall name him Emmanuel in the text in Isaiah. The one who names the child is the one who is pregnant with and delivering the child. She shall name him Emmanuel. Now, it's instructive, I think, to compare Isaiah 123 to Matthew 123 to Isaiah 7:14 in the Greek version of the Old Testament, the Septuagint. Because here you will see where Matthew finds his language. The person in both is he parthenos, the virgin. So Matthew clearly seems to be following the Greek here. Engastri hexe is the exact expression, she shall conceive, that Matthew picks up quite obviously from the Septuagint. But it's interesting, she shall bear a son, that is from the Septuagint as well. But when you move to act number 3, you move from a second person singular, she shall name him or call his name, Emmanuel, to the plural, they shall name him Emmanuel. So it looks like Matthew is following, as Matthew typically does, like most New Testament writers, when they quote the Old Testament, they typically quote the Greek translation that they knew much better than the Hebrew. In some cases, they probably didn't know the Hebrew at all. So this is not unusual that we find this here. Matthew follows the Septuagint very closely, except in Act 3, where the person naming the child moves from the woman to some unidentified group. They shall call him or name him Emmanuel. So then you have these 3 representations of Isaiah 7:14 presented here in red. Look, this is Isaiah in the Hebrew. Look, the young woman is with child and shall bear or is delivering a son and shall name him Emmanuel. To the Septuagint, look, the virgin shall conceive and shall bear a son. And you, this is interesting because the Septuagint doesn't read She shall bear. It reads, you shall bear. That's whoever Isaiah is talking to. The king, presumably, but it's not identified in the Septuagint. To Matthew, look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel. So Matthew used the Septuagint for the person, the virgin, and Acts 1 and 2, but departed from it in Act 3, where he has they instead of the virgin naming the son. Matthew also ignored the literary and political context of not only the Hebrew, but the Septuagint, because the Greek translation agrees with the context of the Hebrew. And like the Hebrew, the Septuagint has a prophecy that concerns only the time of Ahaz and not a distant future event. So we can't look to the Septuagint to find a long-term, multi-century prophecy. So more than other gospel writers, however, Matthew declared that various events in Jesus' life fulfilled Old Testament prophecies. In his infancy narrative, he has 4 of these, with the aorist passive of the verb plarao, meaning to fulfill. Passive would be in order that it might be fulfilled, that kind of language. One of these is what we're talking about here, and we've seen that it misquotes Isaiah 7:14 and takes it out of context. In the next chapter in Matthew, chapter 2, verse 15, Matthew says, he quotes a line that says, this fulfilled what was stated, that out of Israel I've called my son, out of Egypt I've called my son. And that justifies the trip to Egypt in the Christmas story. While this refers to Hosea chapter 11, verse 1, it only partially quoted that material and takes it completely out of context. Clearly, the son that Yahweh or God called out of Egypt in the Old Testament text referred backwards historically to the Exodus of the calling out of the people of Israel from Egypt, not the entrance into Egypt by Jesus and his family. The third one of these in the infancy narrative is 2 verses later, where the justification for the family of Joseph to go to Egypt is rendered. And this is said then to reflect what was written in the book of Jeremiah. A voice was heard from Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they are no more. This is a misapplication of Jeremiah 31:15 to Bethlehem. It seems to refer to another place, actually, and takes it completely out of context. The final one of these in this chapter, Matthew has many of these throughout his gospel, but 4 of them found right embedded in his infancy story. When they come back from Egypt, the angel appeared to Joseph and said, don't go back to Judea because of the political unrest there and so on. And so Joseph decided to go up north to Galilee and reside in the town of Nazareth. Well, this is unique to Matthew's story because in Luke's story, Joseph and Mary are already living in Nazareth before the whole birth event takes place. And so Matthew's problem, as I said last year, was how do I get this person who was clearly born in Bethlehem to Nazareth? Because in his lifetime, he's known as Jesus of Nazareth. This is how Matthew does that. Luke's problem was, how do I get this person whose mother to be and legal father were from Nazareth? How do I get him to Bethlehem to be born? Because we all know that Jesus of Nazareth was born in Bethlehem. So these 2 writers come at it from different ends of the spectrum, and a problem is presented to one, how do I get him to Nazareth? The other one, how do I get him born in Bethlehem? And Luke, of course, handles that by having the government appoint or declare that all the people of Jewish background were to return, kind of preposterous thing, to their home cities to be registered. And since Joseph was from the lineage of David, he had to go back to Bethlehem. That's how Luke gets Jesus to Bethlehem and born in Bethlehem. How Matthew gets Jesus to Nazareth is through the citation of this text. The only problem with this one is we don't know the source. There's nothing quite like that in the Hebrew Bible. Maybe it's referring to Samuel or Samson or something like that, but it's not. We don't have a particular quotation. He will be called a Nazorian, a name which is referring only loosely to Nazareth because it has some of the same consonants in Hebrew as the word does in as the word Nazareth. So that Matthew is quoting the Old Testament in 123 is not unique in general for Matthew throughout his whole text, but is particularly appropriate, it seems, to his approach or characteristic of his approach, even in this infancy narrative. So, summarizing then Matthew 123, near the beginning of his infancy narrative, Matthew characteristically identified this signature event in the life of Jesus of Nazareth, his virginal conception, as a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. Citing Isaiah as the prophet to be the source of the prophecy, Matthew quoted, as it were, a modified version of material from Isaiah 7:14, according to the Septuagint, removed it and presented it contrary to its literary and political context. So, although the idea of the virginal conception of Jesus was not unique to Matthew, see, for example, Luke 1:27, and compare in Luke to 1:34, he was not the only writer to link it. He was, however, the only writer to link it to Old Testament prophecy. Now, in looking at the Adventist Bible commentary on some of this material, I saw a reference to the sort of landmark publication from 1954 called Problems in Bible Translation. And I decided to look at that fairly lengthy discussion found on pages 151 to 169 on Isaiah 7:14. That's the title of the section. And here is a selection of the summary and conclusions at the end of that section. And these are the words of that book. The doctrine of the virgin birth is implicit throughout the scriptures. Doesn't really say how that is the case, and would stand firm even if it did not appear in Isaiah 7:14 and Matthew 1:23. The word alma, virgin, does denote simply a young woman of marriageable age, whether engaged or not, married or not, virgin or not. So that's a very appropriate and accurate statement, as is the next one. The word betulah is the Hebrew word for virgin. Isaiah uses it repeatedly, meaning throughout his writing, and the Holy Spirit would have guided him. Notice the speculation. And the Holy Spirit would have guided him in the choice of Betulah in chapter 7:14 if it had been essential to express what had been revealed to him. And now, this interesting conclusion. Thus, the prophecy of Isaiah 7:14 had a local and literal fulfillment in the days of Isaiah. But that doesn't account for Matthew. So the last statement in this conclusion is the following. By inspiration, Matthew was led to see in the historical circumstances and prophetic message of Isaiah 7:14 a prophecy of the virgin birth of the Messiah, and to use the word parthenos in quoting the prophecy. It provides no justification for that supposition. Well, let's talk a little bit here about implications for reading the Old Testament in the light of this. Ancient Jewish readers of the Hebrew Bible interpreted their sacred text in various ways and through various means. This included Jewish Christians and their descendants. There were basically four types of Jewish exegesis: literal interpretation, which was understanding a text just as it reads; allegorical interpretation, understanding a text symbolically; midrashic interpretation, which was applying a text to a later situation, although it tended to leave the original text intact. And then the final one, pesher interpretation, which was reading a current situation in the light of an existing text. That typically involved, as we'll see here, a disregard for any original wording or context, often including textual alterations and variants, selecting one that would work better than another. This form of interpretation is especially associated with Qumran. We find the word pesher introduced in many commentaries, scrolls that were commentaries on biblical passages or biblical books. And so after citing a text, the scroll would simply say, now the pesher is. So pesher was a Hebrew word that meant this is the interpretation we're going to give it. And these interpretations exclusively dealt with the time, place, and circumstances of the interpreters. This was Matthew's usual type of interpretation. Notice the equivalent of the word pesher in verse 22 in Matthew 1. All this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. So this would have been very familiar language to a person at Qumran. Note also Matthew's use of pesher throughout the whole gospel, but especially in other parts of the infancy narrative, as we had seen a few moments ago. So here we have then a set of implied questions. How should we regard the New Testament misquoting the Old Testament or taking it out of context? That is to say, one allegedly inspired author misrepresenting another. Does the interpretation of an Old Testament text given by a New Testament writer become normative or take precedence over the meaning of that text in its original setting? Can modern interpreters of the Old Testament effectively use the same exegetical methods as the writers of the New Testament? And should we read the Old Testament the same way today? Well, here are these questions with my answers for what they may be worth. To the first one, how should we regard the New Testament misquoting or taking the Old Testament out of context? We should simply acknowledge their practice and note when they are wrong. Does the interpretation of an Old Testament text given by a New Testament writer become normative? No. The Old Testament stands on its own meaning and the New Testament on its. So in this case, if that is to be, if one works from that perspective, Isaiah 7 in its entirety would have nothing to do with the distant future. Matthew's version of it, however, puts it in that context. So that becomes, puts it in a future context occurring in Matthew's day. That becomes part of the fabric of the New Testament, but it doesn't affect how the Old Testament should be read on its own terms. Can modern interpreters of the Old Testament effectively use the same exegetical methods? They can, but should not use such methods. Should we read the Old Testament the same as they? No. We should read the Old Testament as it is and in its context. So Matthew states that Jesus was virginally conceived by Mary in fulfillment of an 8th century old prophecy by Isaiah. However, the prediction in Isaiah 7 relates to Yahweh giving Ahaz, king of Judah, a sign that for the nation's future, he should rely on divine assistance instead of a political alliance. That sign involved a young local pregnant woman delivering a son and about to name him Emmanuel. It also assured the king that before the boy reached maturity, Judah's enemies would be eliminated. So, according to the text and context of Isaiah 7, the prophet did not predict the virginal conception of Jesus, despite Matthew's claim. Although we may understand Matthew's statement, given his typical way of reading Jewish scripture, we should not use such an approach today, nor should we read Isaiah 7, including verse 14, in the light of Matthew 1:22 and 3. That is my word for the day.
Thank you, Warren. Bill, I'm going to keep an eye on the chat here. I don't know who is going to be the chatter with me, but I'll look forward to hearing from you. We already have 2 raised hands. Well, let me just start by saying the first thing that came to my mind when I was listening to this last concluding section was sitting in class in Walla Walla College, and my professor was a chap named Paul Grove, and I can still remember him saying, a subsequent inspired writer can make a previous inspired text say anything he wants it to say. He's got that permission. He's inspired, so he can just take it and reinterpret it and make it his own thing. And at the time, I guess, I didn't know what to do with that. I just accepted that was the case. You see it quite differently. You seem to give a lot more weight to the original passage.
Yeah, well, you're quite right in reflecting on what you were taught. If you read the Adventist Bible commentary um, on Matthew 1, you're almost directly quoting what is found there. That is to say, I mean, language is used like, well, Isaiah wouldn't say it that way if that wasn't so.
Mhm.
Isaiah, we're talking about an inspired writer of the New Testament. He wouldn't tell us if it was different. But see, the implication for that is that that's what Isaiah means. But it's only verse 14 that means that in Isaiah. Like Pilgrims and Bible translation admit, um, everything else in that material in Isaiah 7 is dealing with the time and place of Isaiah and King Ahaz. So does that make any sense that if you're reading the Old Testament, you come to Isaiah 7, and for first 13 verses, you're convinced that this is really dealing with their own local political and religious circumstances. And then suddenly you come to verse 14 and it says, wow, this is a prophecy 8 centuries in the future. First of all, that would make
Mhm.
no sense whatsoever to Isaiah or to Isaiah's hearers or readers that suddenly that shift was in place. Now, I could give you examples all over the New Testament of this kind of thing. And some of them you would not blink an eye at because you wouldn't anticipate, for example, that in Psalm 69 and 109, you have a little line in the middle of two imprecatory psalms where the writer is damning his enemies to hell, literally. And then
Hmm.
suddenly there's a line in there which Peter is said in Acts 1 to refer to Judas. And when I have taught that before, and I've asked readers in advance to read to read these Psalms, and asked them if they recognize anything in there that would seem like a prophecy for the long distance future. Nobody has ever come up with a notion that this was a prophecy, this little line that is picked up in Acts 1. Now, if I gave them Isaiah 7, of course, that wouldn't be the case because they would recognize that language.
Right.
But in other places where you find this going on, people would not, even today, have the remotest clue that any of this little excision from the text had something to do with the distant future. So, here in Isaiah, we're dealing with a well known text, and therefore the emotion and, first of all, the knowledge, followed by the emotion, will take over. But this is characteristic of what we find in the New Testament. And if I were to have started with Isaiah, with the two imprecatory Psalms and Acts chapter 1, you would never have guessed where I was headed with it. Not in a lifetime would you ever guess that. But you obviously would guess it on this one. But this is Christmas time, so I'm using this text with you.
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. Okay, I'm keeping an eye on the time here. We've got about an hour to talk. And Doug, I'm going to start with you.
And Lauren, before you start with Doug, can I just let you know that we've got five in our class who are wanting to make some points too.
All right. Okay. Thank you. And I'm looking at the Malin Kutsi account here, and if you could have Steve or whoever is on there tell me who's coming up next. I also see Dr. Elber here, so I know that he's part of that group.
Yeah, the trick with this is some of our class members are there on Zoom with you, and then we have a classroom here. So I
Got it.
represent
Okay.
the five who are in class.
All right. Doug?
Dr. Trenchard, this was very intriguing. Shoot, I'm not a historian. I'm certainly not a scholar, but I was raised with the Matthew account and the Luke account, and it was it was just a good Christmas story until more recent years. A year ago, your presentation on Luke, and just this morning, just a few hours ago, podcast by Herb Montgomery, which paralleled much of what you were saying and went a lot further in certain respects. Uh, I think the problem in some ways that I've been raised with is that I was raised with the Bible as being religious when you've clearly brought out the point that Isaiah was political. He was in a political problem and he was speaking truth to power in the context, at least as I understand it, of where he was with Judah. And then, of course, Matthew. And I'm trying to apply that to today. And here's what I pick up, and just interested in your thoughts. In the context of Matthew, the the context is political. The Jewish nation they're a vassal state. Um, they're under Rome. They're under the empire. And the leadership has sold out to Rome. And most of the people are worse off because of that. Um, I'll use a term here. I hope it's not offensive. Sometimes we talk about politics with one party getting into bed with another party. To me, that's what the Virgin is all about. It's about in the case of Isaiah, the prophet telling the king not to get in bed with this other foreign entity and to stay the virgin Israel, stay the virgin Judah that it was meant to be. So Matthew, in the context of empire, the oppressive empire, that the leadership, the elite of Judah, has gotten into bed with Rome, including in the temple. And that's what Jesus was all about, as I read it now, not maybe 30, 40, 50 years ago when I was a much younger person. And applying that today, because I need to know what today is all about, is it's speaking truth to power about empire getting into bed, religion getting into bed with the current empire. And if there is truth to power, it's don't do that. It is not the right thing to do. Not just right and wrong, but it's not smart because it takes religion in the wrong direction, and 90%, 95% of the people are harmed because of that. Yes, the elite do well, but that's not what Jesus was about. He was about the common person. He was the common person who was born in a stable, if we take the rest of the story. So that's what I apply it to. Maybe you've got a completely different way of applying it to today, but that's my application to today is religion ought to not be in bed. And this is a common Adventist theme, ought to not be in bed with empire. And that was true in Isaiah's time, and it was certainly true in Jesus' time as articulated by the writers of Matthew. So
Warren, Warren is Doug right that the Jesus story is also a political story? Is Matthew telegraphing that to us?
It's, well, I'm not prepared to necessarily embrace that entirely, but in general, I would say that's an appropriate application of the text. And in general, I think, it makes much more sense to interpret biblical materials in the light of our world today and apply them in circumstances than it would be to do the reverse. Well, there are some problems with that to some extent if you deal with Matthew in particular. We tend to assign the date of Matthew and Luke to sometime in the 80s of the first century. And one of the reasons for this, of course, is that Matthew and Luke are heavily dependent on the Gospel of Mark, which was written much earlier. And even by the time of Mark, the principal Roman figure in the Christmas story is not actually a Roman at all. It's Herod the Great, who was partly Jewish, but was a vassal king appointed by the Romans. So he represented the Romans in that day. And in the days of Jesus, a son of Herod the Great, Antipas, was that representation for Galilee. And for Judea, it was the direct Roman procurator. In the latter part of Jesus' life, it was Pontius Pilate. So Rome vassals were clearly involved in the story of Jesus throughout, right from the time of birth. Even Luke represents that Jesus was born during the reign of Herod, but that's all he does with Herod. Matthew makes Herod an integral part of the story. And it may well be that in the 80s of the first century, this continued to be an issue for Matthew and the church that Matthew was writing to, which was largely then out in the Roman Empire more directly than and located in Palestine.
Hmm.
That would take a lot more thinking on my part to connect the dots exactly in that way. But in general, I'm certainly open to that reading of the text.
Yeah, there are certainly political interpretations of the Jesus event that a lot of people have made. Our next question is from Jim Walters.
Oh, see, do I need a microphone?
Yeah, we're gonna get the microphone to Jim.
Okay, thank you, Lauren. Okay, Warren, thank you very much. What would you think of this observation, and that when it comes to describing your own methodology that you would prefer, that it might be described as you prioritize technical accuracy as the scholarly world of which you're a part, and which I'm a part, currently view, currently espouse. And it's for that reason that you would say, going to your conclusion, that when we read the Old Testament today, no, we should not read it like was done by Matthew reading Isaiah. We should do it according to our own technical accuracy. And if I've characterized you appropriately, what would you do with what happened at the Claremont United Church of Christ last Sunday when I took my 3 grandsons, 7 to 10 years of age, to a pageantry that the UCC's youngsters put on, where they paraded down in angelic white and halos to the front, and then they were dismissed for their Sunday school while the adults went on and did their adult thing. I was very interested in that, and I'm interested in what we ought to do as thoughtful members today when we recognize, when I recognize what I'm doing along with you is prioritizing technical accuracy, when the human experience, even by these 2 Yale-educated pastors at that UCC, a man and woman, they can preach very erudite sermons regarding Jesus' resurrection on Sunday that you and I would probably agree with, which are not traditional, but yet they can have the kids parade down the center of this Claremont church, the village church from bygone era, which is right downtown, adjacent to the colleges. I mean, it's a very sophisticated church. Anyway, what they do with that old tradition, what do you think?
Good.
Well, are you telling us, Jim, that in this processional, there were wise men and shepherds?
Yes.
Okay. There's no biblical text that brings wise men and shepherds together, as you well know. This is what we talked about last year. So whether there is a connection or not to Isaiah it may be, as you, I think, kind of disparagingly put it, as technical and accurate. I don't think there's anything wrong with technical and accurate. If you have a problem with that, you'd have a problem with early Adventists who felt that they had a technical and proper understanding of Daniel 8:14 and what the meaning of 2300 evening morning was. I mean, just read the stuff. It's certainly their whole faith was being based on technical and proper. So I think for us to raise a question of what you call technical and proper, I think is absolutely appropriate. I'm more interested, though, in reading the Old Testament in its own light, and that we don't stumble along through Isaiah 7 and come to verse 14 and say, aha, here we have 8 centuries in the future. And then in the next verse, we go back to the original political and historical context and literary context of the text. That doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. Now, what you do with Matthew, which, as I have admitted here today, is part of the New Testament, part of the New Testament. But you have your own internal problems with the New Testament because the New Testament does not present, seamlessly parallel material on even the narrative that we're talking about. There is an absolute contradiction in the two Christmas stories in the New Testament. One that assumes that going to Nazareth was a first-time experience for Joseph and Mary, and the other one that assumes that Mary and Joseph came out of Nazareth. You can't have it both ways. So what do? I mean, you can throw up your hands and say, well, I believe that everything that the texts say. But that's really very difficult because the texts don't say the same thing. So your pageant in Claremont was already compromised. Didn't have anything to do with Isaiah, presumably. But the moment you answer the question, there were both shepherds and wise men in the processional, you're not dealing with a single biblical account. You're dealing with two biblical accounts that are contradictory.
Very good. Good question, Jim. You are you are seeking some consistency that we obviously have not are not working on, at least in our even in our nativity sets that we have in the coffee table. Laren Kurtz, you're up next.
Thank you very much, and Warren, thank you for a very clear description of the problems between Isaiah and Matthew. Very, very helpful. And just regarding the two different traditions in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, they have the same sort of thing where there are apparently two different reading traditions, and one you will see in the Kethiv, the written and the read. So that is typical of biblical literature. So it seems that you have it in both Old and, as you're pointing out, in the New Testament as well, similar thing. Reason I raised my hand, I wanted to ask you something that is admittedly speculative, and in that sense, perhaps a bit unfair to ask you, but possibly to consider the possibility. A possibility comes out of an article that I read some time ago, suggesting that the ages ascribed to several of the pre-flood patriarchs had been changed in the Masoretic text because the Christians had been using these ages to arrive at the fulfilled time of Christ's arrival. So the comparison was between the Masoretic text and the Samaritan Pentateuch and so on. That seemed to show different ages of some of the patriarchs. And the suggestion was that there was some intentional activity post 70 AD destruction of Jerusalem that may account for some of that. And I'm just wondering if there's a possibility that we might have the same sort of thing happening in the Isaiah 7 text, where the term that is reflected in the Septuagint may have been original in the Hebrew of that time, but that the text was updated, and that was typical in probably many instances where text in the Old Testament has been updated. This may have had a sort of a religio-political intent to it, where the Hebrew, in fact, was updated to reflect a young woman as opposed to a virgin. Just wondering if that might be considered in your estimation as a possibility. Thanks.
Warren, is that a textual problem?
Yeah, well, an updating of the text, an editorial, an explanation of the change in the Masoretic text, in the Old Testament text, as we typically study it.
Well, that leads us into some complex historical and textual observations. You're quite right about the patriarchs, but the interesting thing that happens with the patriarchs in the Septuagint is that during, for the first 10 of these, at least, that you have in I think I'm just talking off the top of my head now, but I think it's Genesis 5, leading up to the flood story. Um, those so-called 10 patriarchs, the first 10 up to the time of the flood, Noah being the last one. The Septuagint adds 100 years to the age of every one of the patriarchs, not in total years, but from the time, to the time in which they had their first son, or at least that they had the son who was going to be considered in the genealogy. So let's say there's a son named A, and the Septuagint, instead of saying that this patriarch was 120 years old when he had this son, the Septuagint would say he was 220. So it add 100 years. So not necessarily to the life of the patriarch, but to the time period in the genealogy. So basically you have then in the Septuagint genealogies of Genesis 5, I think it is, 1,000 years longer between Adam or creation and the flood. Now, I was lecturing on this many years ago in Canada in Banff National Park, where a group of biology students, along with some representation from the Geoscience Research Institute, were present. And the students were looking at geological phenomena around them in Banff National Park, which is quite spectacular. And the person from GRI was trying to make some sense out of this in terms of a 6,000-year-old world. Well, this guy from the GRI heard me talk about this, and he said, wow, the Septuagint actually adds 1,000 years to the time between creation and the flood. He said, that's amazing. He said, that gives me another 1,000 years. We're not limited to 6,000 years. He looked at this as an incredible revelation. Now, I don't know how you deal with a world, in terms of modern geology by simply adding 1,000 years to it, but he felt it was an incredible relief. Well, yeah. So I mean, we can do this sort of thing and ask the question: well, what's the motivation? What's the motive behind a change like that? Or if it is a change, I mean, maybe the Septuagint has, a particular bias. Maybe it doesn't. The Septuagint is not always extending the time period, so you can't necessarily assume that. You get Paul in Galatians referring to the time between Abraham and the giving of the law on Mount Sinai, when in the Hebrew Bible, this is actually a time that's twice as long. So you run into these. This is why I conclude not so much that one is better than the other, but that none of them can accurately represent reality in terms of time. So I'm much more comfortable with an agnostic position on all of these time references, namely that you can't use the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, or combination of the two, to create a chronology of the world. There's so much variation back and forth internally within text, externally from one text outside into the Hebrew or whatever the case may be. So that, I don't think that's possible. You can pick and choose and figure out, like this person from GRI who said, well, you've now given us another 1,000 years that we can work with. Well, it wasn't my intention, but if it works for him, I guess it's okay. So I don't know. That gets to be a very dicey thing to try to anticipate the motivation behind a translator, and think of the fact that this translation called the Septuagint was done in a period of about 150 years, starting in about the middle of the 3rd century BCE. So by the time you come to the New Testament, this was the text that New Testament writers and Christians generally were using.
Our next question comes from Stephen Shull. Hi, Stephen.
Hi. So one thing that I've thought before about this passage from Isaiah that's quoted or misquoted in Matthew is that the biggest problem with it is that Jesus's name was Jesus, not Emmanuel.
Mhm.
And that having this maybe the first time that I've seen both the Isaiah text and the Matthew text alongside each other, and the difference, the changing the subject from she to they, if it's an intentional change, which I have no idea, but that maybe that could be a way that Matthew is trying to reconcile the fact that his name isn't Jesus, that they'll call him Emmanuel, turns it more into a nickname or a title than his actual name, which it seems pretty clear in Isaiah. It's the actual name of a person that's going to be, or that's being born. And then I was curious about that as a way to interpret the change of subject.
That's a good question, Warren. I was wondering that same thing. How come Emmanuel shows up in the story, in the first story, but we never call him that afterwards?
Right. That's interesting. I could have gone into that. I know that situation, but I did talk about the subject changing from she. Actually, the subject seems to change twice. From she's the one who calls him Emmanuel in the Hebrew text of Isaiah, but in the Greek text of Isaiah, it is you singular will call him. So whoever Isaiah is speaking to. Whereas in Matthew, using the Septuagint, does not use that. He uses they. And it may well be that it's because he knew Jesus was not publicly known that way. But Matthew creates his own problems by, of course, in the story in Luke, it's the angel came to Mary in Nazareth and said, you will call him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins and so on. You will call him Jesus. The woman, Mary, is to call him Jesus. In Matthew, it's the angel says to Joseph, you will call him Jesus. Now you can reconcile in that, I suppose, saying, well, they both would call him Jesus. But it is interesting that it is very complicated. And then you got they calling him Emmanuel. You're quite right. It does stick out as unusual because not only does the writer there not say, he doesn't say you like the Hebrew, or I'm sorry, the woman, she will call him Emmanuel, or you, speaking to the whoever it is, the king, or so I suppose in Isaiah 7, but they. But then you go on the rest of the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is never known as Emmanuel. That's a unique sort of thing. So you have Matthew tied to Isaiah in that sense, but doesn't connect the dots in any way.
Thank you. Our next Ian Hartley is next, and then I'm going to go to Albert Camacho.
So in Isaiah 14, Ezekiel 28, we use as filling in the history of the devil. Can you comment on that? I don't think there's any New Testament substantiation for that.
There's a parallel there, isn't there, Warren?
Well, yeah, we don't have the New Testament involvement so much directly, but there, the problem, or I should say the challenge, let's just call it a challenge. The challenge to the reader of those two passages is the context of the material. And I know there are those who try to justify that this is not talking about the king of Babylon or of Tyre. But that's a very, that's a very difficult stretch for most readers of those texts in their setting. And it doesn't require reading them in the Hebrew. You can read them in the Greek, you can read them in the English, including the King James Bible, the Textus Receptus, whatever. And the context, it's very, very challenging I happen to think impossible to be able to identify someone as these references as being references to Lucifer, and particular Lucifer, who falls from his role as the morning star and so forth. That is a different issue than what we're dealing with, and I'm not prepared to go beyond that today without, setting it up in much more detail than I have time to do at this moment.
That'll be for another class. Dr. Elber Camacho.
Thank you
Nice to
very
see you, Elber.
much. Good to see you all, and fantastic presentation. And I would like, if possible, to put it into context of the two presentations I gave recently to our Sabbath seminar, in which I reviewed how religion, as the human's desire for meaning and for the infinite, evolved from the time 60,000 years BCE to the axial age. So I wonder if it is possible to put all the technical knowledge that, as Jim Walters mentioned, in the context of how religion evolved from the time of Isaiah, and then to Jesus' time, and then to how Christianity used this story to add legitimacy to Jesus, and then how the Catholic tradition, through these councils, made this a very important aspect, and then come to today. How will this affect, or how should it be presented to our Seventh-day Adventist tradition of sola scriptura? And I find Elaine Pagel's approach that she describes this very well in, I think it's in Miracles, her book about miracles, of how this became so important to the early Christianity. So, taking all this together, how can we frame this today? Now bring it to us today. How to frame the virgin birth today in ways that are faithful to Scripture, historically responsible, and intelligible to a modern, scientifically informed audience.
Warren?
Yeah, that's right. Microphone out.
Well, I mean, there are various ways of doing this, I suppose. We have, I think, become accustomed to the notion that the virginal conception of Jesus, even outside of a Catholic environment where we talk about the Virgin Mary and her immaculate conception and so on, even outside of that, there are ways, I think, of dealing with Christology without considering the virginal or requiring the virginal conception of Jesus. And I say this because the earliest reflections of Jesus of Nazareth that we have show no knowledge of this declaration. As far as I'm concerned, the earliest material we have would be what we call the Q material. This is the material in Matthew and Luke that they have in common with each other, broadly speaking, but they did not get from Mark. Now, we don't have Q as a document. What we have Q is as a phenomenon that represents this material in Matthew and Luke that didn't come from Mark. For example, a lot of the material that we find embedded in the so-called Sermon on the Mount is also found in Luke 6 and other places in Luke. And with regard to a large amount of that, none of it appears in Mark. So modern biblical scholarship tends to see this as material available to Matthew and Luke outside of Mark. And so that material is interesting because the word Christos, for example, Christ, does not even appear in that Q material, at least the Q material that we have access to. There is no birth story. There's also no crucifixion story, no passion narrative. So Jesus is presented primarily as a teacher. So we have teaching material for the most part. Also, prior to the writing of the Gospel of Mark, which probably came along in the late 60s of the first century, or the early 70s, somewhere around just before or after the destruction of Jerusalem. 20 years or so, 20 to 25 years before Matthew and Luke wrote. We also have not only Q during the 40s probably of the first century, but we have at the end of the 40s and into the 50s, all of it before the 60s of the first century, the writings of Paul. Paul's genuine letters were all written during that time to places like the region of Galatia, to the city of Corinth, etc. Neither Q nor Paul, and interestingly enough, nor Mark, that is to say, for the first 30 years of Christianity, there is no hint or mention of the virginal conception of Jesus. Now, Paul is the one who puts the life of Jesus into theological context. It is Paul who creates the narrative about the meaning of the death and resurrection of Jesus, certainly much more than the gospel writers. And all of this dealing with material that is not even hinted at in Q. So prior to the time of AD 60, we have a robust international Christianity that had no need, apparently, for a narrative about the virginal conception of Jesus. So and when you come to the end of the first century, you have the Gospel of John, which is the most theologically developed material about Jesus of Nazareth that we have outside of Paul. And John sees no reason to engage in discussion about virginal conception of Jesus. He goes over that and he jumps over that entire thing to some kind of primordial, in the beginning was the word theology, logos theology. So we have in the New Testament itself some significant interpretations of Christianity, seminal, in the case of Paul, interpretations of Christianity, which dominated Christian theology, which dominates it even today. And none of that requires virginal conception. So if we choose to maintain and foster a Christology today without the virginal conception of Jesus, we would not be alone, and we would not even be unbiblical.
That's pretty powerful stuff you gave there. Thank you. And I'm going to go now to, is it Dr. Testerman who is next?
Was it Priscilla? Priscilla.
Okay, Priscilla.
Thank you, Warren, especially for your last comments. I think if you give this presentation again, I personally would feel more comfortable if you included what you just said in your conclusion of your talk. I would like to, my question, I guess, is how does this discussion fit into my faith or my lack thereof? And then I would like to also share that I can't remember if it was, I think when my sister was telling me that that there are different views of the Christians' narratives on Jesus' birth. And I remember after her discussing that, a preacher talking about the 10 virgins being another word for just young woman, or probably a group of young teenagers that were female. And then, grappling myself with how do we look at Jesus as fully human? I mean, fully human and yet fully divine. And also I remember the first time I heard the Christmas carol, Jesus, our brother, kind and good. And I was thinking, thinking about Jesus as our brother was something I didn't get in my childhood experience. I knew he was Emmanuel and God with us, but I think embracing the full humanity of Jesus is in our tradition, just like you said. And I think the early Christians, who may not have depended on this virgin birth story, I mean, they were so on fire for God, and the Holy Spirit was so infused in them that I believe that the Holy Spirit was really infused in Mary, the mother of Jesus, and she brought him up in a way that she and the Holy Spirit really were molding and forming, as the Christian tradition teaches, as a fully human son, but yet fully divine. And I'm happy to say, where I had questions earlier, I just feel like the whole early Christian story is something that, to me, it seems like a story that's too unusual to have been made up as like a Hollywood movie today would have been. And the power thereof keeps my faith from being dashed against the rocks.
Thank you, Priscilla. Warren?
I don't really have much comment there. I think that, we put together for ourselves individually and collectively in a community various understandings and what makes sense, how do different aspects of our society look at Jesus. There's clearly a legitimate feminist understanding of the biblical record, understanding within North America. Seventh-day Adventism grew up in, New England, basically. It wasn't the same when it went to other parts of this country, let alone going to other countries. Uh, I was asked to do a review of a book on Adventist apocalyptic teaching um, that arose out of a conference in Europe in 2021. And this is one of the subjects I approached. That I was pleased that presenters at that conference, whose articles or essays were represented in the book, at least in some cases, raised the question of how does this fly in Africa today, or in the global South generally? Um, it flies in ways that we wouldn't expect many times, nor should we be concerned about. We should be concerned, I think, if this did not take on global and different regional interpretations.
Mm-hmm.
So what we do today with in our Christology, whether for us a virginal conception is required or necessary, it may be for some. It doesn't appear to have been for many New Testament writers, and I could have added the writer of Hebrews in that context as well, which is probably one of the most penetrating explorations of Christology that we have in all of Scripture. But yet the notion of a virginal conception does not seem to be required in that model. So for some of us, it may be required because it was been part of our tradition and heritage, and it's certainly part of the tradition that Matthew represents, and to some extent Luke, but particularly Matthew because of his invocation of the Old Testament in support of it. But for other Christians at that time, that wasn't necessary. And it may not be necessary for us. For others, it may be necessary. I'm not here to judge that. I'm here been asked to talk about a particular claim on the part of an inspired writer in the New Testament that something in the Old Testament was a prediction of an event. And when we look at the latter, it does not seem to have been so. That was my task today. I'm not here to talk about what you should believe in the modern world today.
The next person is Dr. Courtney.
Hi, long time since I've been
Yeah,
back here.
we've missed you.
So I actually wrote this in the chat earlier, but my phone kind of cut off for a little while. So forgive me if you actually did cover this already. One of the things that I had a question about was you saying that Isaiah narrative was a very local, specific to that region and time, about, the virgin giving birth and all of this. And so I want to know, do you have any idea of what that was referring to? So who in that particular time would have been referenced by the Emmanuel and the Virgin? Who would that be in reference to?
Well, I was starting with the Hebrew text, and the word virgin is not used there. It's the word young woman. So
Well, yeah.
young,
So
young woman.
when I'm using it, I mean like young woman, virgin, young lady, whatever. But who would you think that or not prophecy, but that text would be talking about?
We don't know. In Isaiah 7, the woman is not identified. There's an article there that says the young woman, which suggests to most readers that that was somebody particular who would have been known to the house of David or the court of the king. Maybe it was a person within the context of that group of people. The fact that the king is being addressed to one to whom the sign is given, although it seems to be given more broadly to the whole royal government, but a singular second person is used, in part of this, and so maybe it is the king, and maybe the young woman is a member of the king's harem, somebody who is would have been well known. it was somebody, I think, given, just looking over the shoulder of the writer here from a long distance away in time and place. The person is not identified, but the person had to be known to the group. Otherwise, it would not have functioned as a sign. So it seems likely that in that dialogue between Isaiah and whoever he's speaking to, they knew who he was talking about. It wasn't just anybody; it was the Alma, the young woman, and it was somebody who was apparently known to at that time be pregnant, and probably, if Larry Herr is correct, one who was at that time actually giving birth. All of those things would have been known to the group who received this statement by Isaiah. And
but not known to us.
the only thing that was unknown, which is the real sign of all of this, was that the woman was going to call this child Emmanuel, which itself was not unusual because that was a typical theophoric name, a name that included a reference to deity and so forth. The name Isaiah itself is a theophoric name that relates to, Isaiah and Yahweh. The name Jesus is a Greek, Jesus comes from Joshua, Yehoshua, which is a theophoric name that means Yahweh is salvation. So the notion of a theophoric name itself would not have been unusual, but that she was going to actually call this son Emmanuel would not have been known to anybody, likely. So that's probably what the actual sign was. Who the woman was, I think they knew. We don't know.
Next, I'm going to go to, thank you, Courtney. Next, I'm going to go to Dr. Tester.
Hey, thank you for a very interesting and academic presentation. I think it's been very helpful. The point I want to make is that it seems like you have shown that to take our modern traditional and very traditional Christian and very literal approach to the text is wrong, technically wrong. The academic approach that we have been taking here today is technically correct, but also misses the point. Along the lines, I think, of what Jim Walters was saying and also Doug Myers. If we were to teach the Bible as great literature, and let me make here an analogy. Let's say we're talking about a Shakespeare text instead of the Bible, so we can get off of the emotional investment here. If you were
he was inspired too.
Yes, if you were to teach Henry this, if an English teacher were to stand up in front of her high school seniors and teach Henry II, say, from Shakespeare, as a literal history of, here's where you can find all the accurate information about that king. A historical scholar would quickly come along, as they have done, and point out all the historical errors in Shakespeare. And from that, you could say, oh, well, we could just dismiss Shakespeare as being worth reading because they made all those errors. He made all those errors. Or if you, but on the other hand, the English, and would bore all the students too, by the way, taught that way. But great literature is taught as what are the themes that we find in Shakespeare that are eternal, that are ongoing, that are repeating, that you can relate to in your life and experience today. And she would have them write essays on how they relate personally to the text and the events there. And maybe that is the method by which we should be reading scripture as the great life-transforming literature that it is.
Yeah, you're going to greatly upset Elder Wilson by comparing Shakespeare to the Bible, but I'll let Warren handle this.
Well, I have no problem with reading Shakespeare as Shakespeare, but I wouldn't recommend reading Shakespeare as history. Shakespeare as literature is fine. Shakespeare as history is not fine. I wouldn't expect that the person who would write the history of Henry II to be writing great literature. I would, however, expect them to be writing great history. And so let's just take the example before us. You want to apply the scripture as literature. Okay, let's do so. Let's read Isaiah 7 together. Are you going to tell me that Isaiah 7, 1 through 16 is talking about what it actually seems to be suggesting here, a political conundrum that is facing the kingdom of Judah and its king. And along comes a prophet who says, don't do the conventional political thing. Believe in Yahweh, he'll take care of you. So you're going to say, well, let's read that as literature, because as history, this may already be distorted. Maybe that's not what happened at all. So let's read it as literature. What are you going to do? You're going to apply it to today. I presume what you're going to look at is say, well, here is a different way of dealing with issues that you face. One is to have a political approach, and maybe that makes sense, maybe it doesn't. But there's also a broader, maybe more comprehensive approach, which is just listen to what Yahweh is saying. So the way of reading this as literature today and applying it today would be to presumably say, well, what does it mean to let Yahweh help you decide your future course of action? Okay? But it would not necessarily mean that when you come to verse 14, you suddenly jump out of that entire 8th century BCE context and say, well, yes, but this is referring to Jesus of Nazareth, who is going to be born of a Virgin Mary 8 centuries into the future. But in verse 15, you then go back to the Isaiah and Ahaz story for the next couple of verses. See, that's the problem I have. That is completely misrepresenting then what Isaiah's text is all about. You want to read Isaiah as history? Fine, do so. If you want to read Isaiah like you might read Shakespeare as literature, then do so. But don't take Isaiah himself out of context by assuming that Isaiah then is predicting an event that's going to happen 800 years in the future.
Agreed. But I would
Excellent.
say that still misses the point.
Yeah.
I would go with maybe Elber and Doug Meyer's more literary interpretation of that. And Jim,
well, that's fine. You certainly are free to do that. I would not do that. I would read Isaiah as Isaiah, and I would read Matthew as Matthew, and the two don't happen to coincide as the way I read them, but they can be read both as scripture. That's fine. But to say that Isaiah actually means this, as Matthew tends to say in Matthew 1:22, is, I think, wrong.
Lauren?
Yeah.
Can you hear? It's Bill Shaw.
I can hear you, Bill.
My comment that you may or may not have time for at the end would be perfect here if I could bring it in. Would you permit that?
Yeah. Let me. You go ahead and make your comment, and then I'm keeping an eye on the time. I'm going to skip to Bjorn Karlman to do the final.
Thank
Go
you,
ahead.
Lord. I'm sensitive to John's and Jim's comments, and I think it might help if we were to look at this as modern Christians today might. Actually, I would say postmodern Christians today. Because today we have a wealth of resources, much of which has already been introduced both by Warren and Jim and John Testerman and others in class. We have a wealth of resources to both understand the scriptures and to be able to have insight today. I have to kind of cut to the chase. 50 years ago, we would have used people like Gerhard von Rott, or we would have used Walter Eichrodt to help us understand what the Old Testament said. And today we have Walter Brueggemann, or it's actually Walter, he's an American. We have James Barr, we have Rolf Knierim, we have his interlocutor, Wonil Kim over at La Sierra University. All these Old Testament scholars to help us understand what the Old Testament was about, which I think is valuable, as we have our own Warren Trenchard to help us understand the New Testament and often the Old Testament. Now, but what is my point? I'd like to suggest that regardless of whether or not Bishop John Spong's approach to this is based on legitimate theological study, which it is based on Michael Goulder's research, that his point is valid regardless. You can quibble with me, Warren, if you want. His point is all of this has value and edification for the church. Even the Gospels have legitimacy because, and this is Goulder's point, because the Gospels weren't written to make theological, historical points. They were written for liturgical edification for the Christian community. And if you look at what Matthew said in the context of a meaningful reading of the Old Testament to encourage faith in the first generation of the Christian church, then we can go beyond that. Throughout the history of the Christian church, we can, to this day today, we can look back at all of this. We can look back at the parade of children dressed up as angels. We can celebrate the story of Isaiah, Emmanuel. We can say, okay, this is really what Matthew was up to. I mean, this was a pre-modern time, but they were celebrating Jesus, right? And we can do that today, and at the same time, maybe not be so distracted that we still don't go back to the Old Testament and look for what else it has to say, which those scholars help us with, which Warren, you help us with, which I will want to emphasize that our moderator today, Lawrence Seibold, has a doctorate that isn't just in pastoring, but he had to take a lot of extra theology classes at GTU also, which you help us with, as we are encouraged by all of these things when we go from week to week in worship. We might even see the power of the teaching of social justice in the prophets, which we are otherwise distracted from because we get riveted on whether or not there was a Virgin Mary. Sorry. That's what I want to say.
Yeah, very good. We're getting to the end here, Warren, and I don't want to keep you too long. Bjorn Karlman has one important point, and then Don Casebowl is going to have our last question. I'm sorry to the rest of you. We just ran out of time.
All right. I hope you can all hear me. I've got 9-year-olds running around this house, 9 and 10-year-olds. So if there's an interruption and some shrieking, you'll know what's going on. It's evening here in England. Thank you very much for the chance to talk. I'm going to do my brief thank you for everyone that has supported the year-end fundraiser at Adventist Today. It's nice to see the Loma Linda crew with us today as well. It was fun to meet with you guys just a few weeks back now. So at the Ellen White's panel conversation. The way you guys give means that we can have ATSS, that we can have Adventist Today, that we can have open conversation. And so it's very worth supporting. If you haven't had a chance, I'll drop a link where you can do your part to support accessible independent journalism and this kind of conversation at ATSS. Dr. Trenchard, my question is, goes back a little bit to a few questions ago. You made the comment that we have different interpretations perhaps in the global north than you would have in the global south, and that is okay. And I agree that's okay. I am very much from the global north. I'm Swedish, but I grew up in the global south, and so my burden for Adventism, if you like, is not so much in finding where we can have opinions where we differ, because they're going to be inevitable. I mean, culture and just the context make for very different understandings of Adventism. But I'm very interested in, if you were to boil down the essential components of a sort of a universal Adventism, how would they? What would they look like? What do you think would appeal across the board that wouldn't be linked to just our geography?
I'll just preface this by saying,
30 seconds.
I mentioned to Lauren before, one of the perils that I run into every time I make a presentation like this is that people ask me to talk about everything under the sun. And I'm
no exception.
Yeah, so this class today is no exception to that. But yeah, that's an important point. It goes beyond what I was dealing with today, but it's a relevant point. It would take me some time to think about that and craft an answer that hopefully might at least be cogent, if not acceptable. But I would just say in general that Christianity started out as a Hellenistic Jewish religion. And it was very, very oriented to, therefore, the Hebrew scriptures. Not in Hebrew, interestingly enough, but primarily in Greek, because that's what they were reading at that time. But as Christianity moved out, starting with the Pauline mission to the Eastern Mediterranean world, it began to interact with, and to some extent, adopt to the world that it was moving into. And I think that is the genius that has made Christianity relevant for the many centuries and millennia that has existed. It has had the power to make a difference in the lives of people wherever they are found. But that requires an understanding of those people, their context, their concerns and issues and problems, their history, their politics and social understanding, their religious experience. So I'm going to give you a general answer. I think Seventh-day Adventism, to survive well into the 21st century and beyond if necessary, it's going to have to do the same thing. And I could be more specific and talk about particular things. I won't do that now. But in terms of re-understanding our heritage, re-understanding the experience of the Millerites, and the impact of some of that on early Adventism, is that as significant today as it was then? I think we need to ask these kinds of questions. Is it as significant for people in South Africa, or in New Zealand, or even in Yugoslavia or Sweden?
Right, China.
So that's all I can say at this point. I think we have a good example within the New Testament of that process already taking place. And we have a good example of the post-New Testament church of it taking place, not always in a good way, but generally, that the Holy Spirit can be relied upon to direct the development of the Christian commitment to Jesus of Nazareth in new and exciting ways as it moves through time and place.
It's a great answer, Warren. Very good
Thank you.
answer.
I realize that was a curveball question, but I appreciate the answer.
And our last comment or question, Don, I wanted to make sure we got you in before everybody leaves. It's so nice to see you again. Haven't
Thank you.
talked with you much since we met in Loma Linda.
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to make the observation in our Adventist culture, we start out with the Millerite movement, and they had an idea of all kinds of predictive prophecies. You had a mathematical precision. We could prove not just one way with the 2,300 days, but 15 different mathematical proofs with 15 proof texts saying exactly the date that Christ would come. And we still have some of those dates, like the end of time being marked by the Lisbon earthquake in 1755, quarter century ago. And yet, in our modern world, we have another idea of predictive. We're scientific. We do controlled experiments, double-blind studies, and making predictions of what's going to happen. And people feel they can take the same approach to the Bible. In fact, that's what Miller and other people of his era were positing. And in a similar way, throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, the whole of the Old Testament was seen through Christological eyes in the Christian movement, obviously. And so it was quite a surprise to me when I discovered there's, if I recall correctly, only 39 different mentions of Messiah in the Hebrew scripture. Most of those are referring to specific persons like David and Saul and so forth. And even non-Jews like Cyrus, if I remember right. I think even Pharaoh Necho was seen as the anointed by God to fulfill his purposes. And so the Jews, through their trials and tribulations, no matter how wrong no matter how much trouble they got into, the prophets always said, you're going to be able to, God's going to somehow bring you back from Babylon. He's going to restore you to your former state. And then you have about half a millennium, intertestamental millennium, where people are wondering what's happened to us. We're under the Roman thumb, and we're expecting a Christ. And what kind of Christ are we going to have? And supposedly, at that time, a lot of people were looking for a Christ who was going to save them from the Romans, and who's going to be a politically successful Christ. But supposedly they were mistaken, and they should have realized all along that there was a suffering Christ that had to happen first. And for myself, when I studied that, I concluded there really isn't any such thing as a suffering Christ predicted in the Old Testament. There are some vague recollections that are more strained than even the ones that Warren has pointed out to us today. And we still have that idea of predictive prophecy in the Adventist Church, one of which is to see the United States in Bible prophecy as the two horned beast. And there's people making predictions all the time, even in our own day, of how that's applied. And because Ellen White adopted that idea, we take that as valid. But actually, what I've discovered is that J.N. Andrews was the one who came up with that prediction. And he had 10 different reasons why. And if you study his 10 different reasons why the United States had to be predicted in prophecy, they're all completely unreasonable and don't make any sense whatsoever. And so we're still looking forward maybe to some predictive thing that we could make a mathematical prediction right now, but we can't do that, is my thesis. What do you think, Warren?
I'm muted here. Well, you've covered a lot of territory, Don, and certainly, what I'm trying to say here today is I'm trying to argue the truth of my addendum, essentially, that when we read the Old Testament, we should allow it, the writers, the prophets, the historians, whatever, people who are writing whatever they're writing, allow them to say what they had in mind. Allow the writer of Genesis 1 to have say with regard to interpreting God's creative activity, but also the writer of Genesis 2 and 3 to talk about that creative activity from a completely different perspective.
Mhm.
And a fall from the grace that resulted in from the creation. We are so eager to have these overlays on preconceived notions that we use in interpreting this material. I'm really arguing, let it say what it's trying to say. Let Isaiah 7 say what Isaiah was trying to say with that. Now, Matthew can say whatever he wants to about it, and we can take a perspective on that. That's fine. But let us not then go back and say that's what Isaiah had in mind, when it stretches and shatters the imagination of most readers who look at this and say, but that's not what it seems to say. We need to provide for that reaction and legitimatize that and say, well, let us let the Old Testament stand on its own terms. And if the New Testament writer wrongly interprets that, fine. Let's just see that as a phenomenon that is part of biblical interpretation in the first century. But it doesn't have to be our approach because we know different. I would just simply say, Don, I'm tempted to comment a little bit on the word Messiah, Mashiach, which is, as you rightly pointed out, used all over the Hebrew Bible for all different kinds of purpose, people, religious, political figures, in and outside of the Israelite tradition and so forth. But when it comes to Daniel 9, we take not only out of context, and when we find the word Messiah the Prince in Daniel 9:25, we not only take that out of context, but we draw the language from 17th century English translations. There is no translational or exegetical justification for doing that. Daniel 9 is no more of a prophecy of the coming Messiah the Prince than is Isaiah 7:14 a prophecy of a virginal conception. So there are dozens of examples of this. We simply need to come to grips with that. How we develop our own Christianity in the modern world where we happen to live in time and place is another matter. But let us not distort the reading of Scripture in trying to do that. That's really what I'm trying to say today.
That's a very good summary. Thank you very much.